today, just want to get started by saying we have a very interesting guest and someone that I think will enjoy talking to just to get more insights into libertarianism, conservatism, the effect of economics on both, and just some overall interesting topics. So, ladies and gentlemen, my guest is a former president of the Mises Institute. He is a writer, public speaker, advocate for property, markets, and civil society. He takes particular interest in private legal systems and private money as tools for radically decentralizing political power. Those are a lot of words to say, I think. He's got some really good ideas, is what I'm trying to get at, ladies and gentlemen. He's previously worked for Congressman Ron Paul. So that's a lot of cred with my audience, Jeff. And as I kind of give away the thing, everyone, please say hello to Jeff Deist. Jeff, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. And, you know, it's interesting. I'll let the folks in on something. When we were communicating to see when we could book some time to interview you, I initially said, oh, we love having libertarian guests like you, Jeff, on the show. We'd love you to come on. And your initial response, super interesting, but I want to talk about it a little bit. You said, well, I don't know if I'm a libertarian, Big John, but I'd be happy to come on. So let me ask you, what did you mean by that? Because I think libertarian, I think ANCAP, I think Mises guy, I would tend to bucket that under libertarianism. You made it a point of saying, I don't know if I'm a libertarian or not. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's a semantic issue. George Orwell wrote this incredible essay, Politics in the English Language, in 1946. And he was a brilliant guy. I mean, people think of him for his novels, but he had done basically wartime propaganda for the BBC,
right,
for England. So he knew about persuasion and propaganda and advertising. And he came up with this idea, what he called meaningless words. And that's words that are so overused or misused that they become devoid of meaning. Right. So in his era, coming out of World War II, democracy became this synonym for anything good. Fascism became this synonym for any system of government we didn't like. And fast forward, and as you know, we've lost the word liberal.
True.
Liberal today means something entirely different. And I don't like this term classical liberal, which I think is a cop-out because the left doesn't buy it. But classical liberal is really the way that Mises and Hayek delineated themselves from the post-Wilson, post-FDR liberalism of mid-century America, because Mises and Hayek were at their peaks in that mid-century period. So what they really meant by classical liberal, what you and I mean by liberal, is people don't like to say it, they mean a 19th century liberal. And all of a sudden everyone's like, well, I'm not anything 19th century. So libertarian is much the same way. I think it has been misused and overused to the point of meaninglessness.
Okay.
And I don't think it's particularly helpful or accurate now as a marker or as an indicator. So I'm definitely someone who doesn't believe in the state. I don't think the state is the mechanism we need to organize human affairs. I think the market is, and the family and all kinds of civic and social institutions are. The state is not. So anti-state. I do consider myself on the right in the sense, not in the conservative versus liberal sense, but in the sense of being pro-tradition, pro-culture, pro-family, pro-hierarchy, anti-egalitarian. So gotcha. I would say because of those things, I would have to consider myself on the right. And again, libertarians go out of their way. So, well, I'm neither left nor right. Well, good luck with that, folks.
So it sounds to me like your objection was less to, because the things you described in my mind are the way I describe myself and libertarian. I'm comfortable with the word just because I think that's the default category. I can understand the distinction if you mean you're not a capital L libertarian in the sense that you're not, say, a political party libertarian, an LP person. But you describe someone to me that sounds somewhere between a minarchist and an anarchist. And I don't know if you're comfortable with those labels necessarily. But I do agree that words have lost their meaning, right? The same way someone will say, hey, the Republicans freed the slaves, trying to draw some association with today's GOP, with the GOP of Lincoln. totally neglecting the fact that Lincoln's GOP were considered radicals, bloody radicals by the press at the time and their contemporaries, right? Which isn't really today's GOP. So I agree with that. So if I were to say you're not to fall into the sort of the template of the socially conservative, fiscally conservative, socially liberal that you hear of a lot of libertarian descriptions. So it sounds to me like maybe conservatarian, if we created a new word for you, might be accurate.
I mean, I'm not really a conservative in the sense that I'm a political radical.
Right.
Look, libertarians simply means someone who advocates liberty. The problem is there's no generally agreed upon definition of liberty. You and I might say liberty is the absence of state coercion, nothing more, nothing less. Rothbard would say liberty is the absence of the state altogether. But if you ask a Buddhist or a left progressive or all kinds of people, what's liberty? They would not agree with our definition that is simply the absence of state coercion. They would say, well, liberty is this condition, this state of being where you have your basic needs met and you don't have to worry too much about food or rent. And a lot of people would imbue that term with a lot of positive rights things. And so I think we assume so much is universal that isn't.
Agreed.
And so, I'm just really at a point in my life where I'm hoping to get away from ideology and say liberty is not a system. It's not an ideology. It's not a political movement. It's simply what people do naturally when you leave them alone. So I don't like to think of liberty as an ideology. I like to think of it as the absence of an ideology. It doesn't need to be imposed politically. It just happens on its own. So that's I think to most political Americans, that sounds pretty pie in the sky.
Right.
But,
well, it certainly does. Yeah, it certainly does to my partner here, because he's a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, today's conservative, and this is always an office debate, because I'm much more of the philosophical type. Like, I'm drawn into politics simply because it exists, not because I have any love of it or anything like that. But I will ask you this, and I didn't mean to go down this path initially, but since you brought it up, it's an interesting topic. For example, you said people left to their own sort of will, the lack of a coercive state. I agree with all that. But do you, for example, believe in like a night watchman state, something like what I think Nozick originally described as, where it's like the state only exists to make sure that our rights are not our liberty is not infringed by others. Like, do you accept that level of state, or would you? Because individuals left to their own, just to challenge you a little bit, to do as they please, might, one of the things they might please to do is turn overly aggressive, infringe the rights of others. I'm 6'3" and a former wrestler. I could go around dropping a lot of people on their heads and take their property, right? But I don't do that. What is to prevent me from doing that? And if I do engage in that, what kind of remedy is there for the aggressed?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons you don't do that. One is if you were just a terrible, amoral person, it might just be purely the fear of sanction, whether from the police or whatever, or your fellow man. But you're not a terrible, amoral person. So we can assume that there are, you see the mutualism in living in a world where if everyone just went around doing that, it wouldn't just be guys who were 6'4", 240 or something like that. It would also be a guy who's 150 who drops a 90-year-old grandma and takes her purse, right?
Correct.
And so we I think most of us say we just don't want to live in that sort of society. We see a mutual benefit in being able to walk down the street and conduct ourselves and have a house that people don't break into and that sort of thing. So I think that most of what we think of as the order in society is pretty spontaneous. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't terrible actors and monsters and really depraved, sick people who need to be removed. There's no doubt about that, but I think there's a market for that. And I don't think governments do any better job than markets when it comes to police, security, court systems, jail. I mean, jail is just an absolute debacle in this country. There's certain states like California spend something north of $40,000 per year per inmate in their system. I mean, you can give somebody an apartment for that.
Right.
So it's, I wouldn't say that state prisons and the whole idea of the state prosecuting people isn't working all that well. I don't think our criminal justice system is particularly effective. So it's an interesting question. Would I accept a night watchman state? Well, sure, if that's where it ended. And also, if the U.S. federal government had just been reasonable for the last 100 since Wilson, or maybe let's say 1880s, the beginning of the progressive era, the Sherman Antitrust Act, that sort of thing. If the U.S. federal government had just been reasonable since then, a reasonably sound dollar backed by gold, a reasonable foreign policy, a reasonable, true safety net, minimalist welfare state for people who are truly incapable of working or caring for themselves. If it had done just all those basic things, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Rothbard and capism and all this. We'd be grumbling about potholes or something, in our town,
right?
Because our town's government and our state house would matter a lot more to us.
Correct.
Than what happens in Washington, D.C. But it's because government couldn't stay constrained, because it's not the nature of a monopoly to stay constrained, that we're having this kind of endless discussion about whether anarchy could work.
Yeah, and I love the way you phrased it, because you're not being an absolutist in your views, because other than to say you prefer individualism and liberty in that sense. But it's interesting that you use the word reasonable. I mean, I agree with you. If the government were reasonable, if people were reasonable with each other, but obviously pragmatism tells us that's off. I won't say often, but that's in a lot of cases not the situation, where people are not reasonable and power begets power, control begets control. So that's an interesting thing. Like, again, I don't know if we'll ever get to the society that perhaps the two of us envision, but I'd like to have that as a goal. I don't want to just discard liberty because we've had trouble getting there. I still think it's a worthy pursuit for society and for man.
And when I talk about, obviously I'm later on, I'm not 20 something brash anymore, but when I talk about getting away from ideology, when we talk about reasonable, I live in the college town of Auburn, Alabama, 7,500 people. And so it turns out that our state prisons here are pretty abominable and don't have air conditioning. So, if some of my state income taxes have to go to make Alabama prisons air conditioned, to make it just, reasonably humane. And, we have hot, muggy summers down here. Right. But, fine. So that's the 22-year-old me would not have said that. Right. You have no right to tax me for that. That's theft, blah, blah, blah.
Right. I agree with you. But that's interesting, and as we sort of morph our conversation, because a lot of this, I have bullet points, but I didn't have specific structure. So I love talking to you about this. You're an economist. A lot of what you...
No, I wouldn't say I'm an economist. I'm certainly not a trained economist. I am a lay. I have a lay interest in the Austrian school and am reasonably well read for a layman.
Fair enough. And thank you for the distinction. So having said that, what is the role of an economist of studying economics in a free society? How would you categorize? Well, like, what is economics? What is the study of economics? Is it bastardized in recent years?
I better check my watch, man. You might want to go. You might want to go get a cup of coffee, because I could go a long time on this one.
Right.
and look. First and foremost, economics is a social science.
Right.
It is a social science. It is not chemistry or physics, where we can create, view the world, make observations, form a hypothesis, and test it empirically. Okay. Human beings are social animals. They are often irrational, impulsive, jealous, whatever they may be. They're willful. We're not atoms and molecules. So any social science needs to be strongly differentiated from the physical sciences in terms of its approach and its reason for being. So, what's the point of economics? The point of economics is to help us understand the world better, and as a result, to hopefully improve at least our material conditions in the world. So, I would argue that the job of economics is to help us understand human action and choices in the context of scarcity. And I think a lot of our friends on the left think that scarcity is a artifice, that we no longer have scarcity, or we wouldn't have scarcity if it weren't for all these right wingers.
All these greedy billionaires. Billionaires, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The billionaires are hoarding all the money, and that's why the rest of us can't have what we want. And there are people who believe that. But this idea of understanding human beings and the actions they take, the choices they make within a context of scarcity, that gives rise to all kinds of understandings that are mostly deductive, right? We can come up with ideas like time preference that says, all things equal, most people would rather have things now as opposed to later. Would you rather have your dream house at age 40 or age 90?
Exactly.
Well, you'd probably rather have it at 40, because at 90, you're not going to be diving into the pool so easily, and you may not have too many years to enjoy it. And you may not even be able to go up and down the stairs to that dream house. So we can understand time preference just as an axiom. We can understand that human beings value things less as they have more of them. So we can understand marginalism axiomatically. If you go out and get, if you have $100 million and you make another 1 million, you have $101 million. That means a hell of a lot less to you than that first million did.
Right.
Because that first million might have meant, oh my gosh, I was a $40,000 a year guy, and now all of a sudden I have $1 million. That means my house is paid for, my kids are going to go to college. All kinds of things are happening that maybe. So there's all kinds of things we can understand deductively and axiomatically and work from there. Unfortunately, economics has lost its way. It has become basically intellectual cover for governments and moneyed interests. It's become claptrap academia, writing these endless papers that nobody reads, nobody cares about. We no longer have theory in economics. Everything is empiricism and testing. We don't have big treatises that used to be written by guys like Mises. We have just these really narrow topics for which economists win Nobel Prizes on really narrow things like plumbing and economics. Esther Duflo won a Nobel for that. And so the whole profession has gotten away from, in my opinion, what it's supposed to do, which is help us understand the world. And the way to do that is not by writing arcane papers that 3 other economists who have deep knowledge in your little subspecialty will ever read. It's to be a good teacher at university or high school. It's to, write books like Per Byland writes to help average people. So it's a sadly, any profession that becomes part and parcel of academia very quickly falls into, it becomes captured. The point of economics now as a profession is to create jobs for economists. And that's just the nature of anything, especially when governments are involved in government schools. But that's just the nature of how an institution like the discipline of economics gets captured.
Yeah, and it's funny because when you said that, the thing that popped into my head, I used to say the same thing about philosophy professors, that if you were a philosophy student, your employment or your future employment depended on being able to run to the university where the last philosophy professor died. That would be your career path, right? Because people viewed it that way. Let me ask you this. Do you find any distinction between, and I don't know that this term exists, I'm making it up, between a technical economist, like someone who studies to the extent that the data is available, for example, monetary flow or understanding how inflation rates, the more statistical sort of baseline of the economic theory, as opposed to what you described as a social science being, no different than, say, psychology or sociology or something like that?
Yeah, well, as a social science, I would liken it to philosophy and logic.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I look that's a good question for a professional economist. But yeah, there is a role for statistical, mathematical, empirical economics to help us. There's that's fine, but the idea that those sort of corollary or auxiliary skills are not economics per se, right?
Hmm.
Statistics is not economics. Mathematics is not economics.
Right.
Empirical testing is not economics. They can bolster our economic understanding. The problem is that economics today is 95% that stuff and 5% theory. It ought to be the other way around. But
Right.
look, economists respond to incentives like anybody else, and the incentive is to get a tenured job at a university, and that requires publishing. Publishing requires that you specialize in arcane knowledge that nobody cares about. But I mean, that's starting to break. There are big companies. I mean, most economists historically in this country have been employed by universities or by the Fed, for example. The Fed's a big employer. But now more and more economists are being employed by places like Amazon. Whether what they do in their job at Amazon is really pure economics versus sort of this hybrid of behavioral economics, I'll leave to people more knowledgeable than me. But, I think economics is a great degree. I think it's great training for life or business. But I think the graduate and postgraduate level economics and the academic economics is pretty lost.
Interesting. Um, okay, I have so many more questions on that, and I know, like you said, we could go down a rabbit hole, take hours to go through, but I want to avoid that. So let me ask you this: I've seen you on YouTube, I've seen you on some programs. One of the topics that you seem to, at least I think, enjoy talking about is the whole concept of money. And the function of money and what makes for good money. I don't think too many of us really put into too much thought into what is money. I mean, we hear the term fiat currency. Fiat currency will be the death of us all, and fiat currency crushes liberty, and we need real money. We need this and that. So let me ask you: Can you give the audience like a very high level summary of, in your opinion, what is money and what makes for good money?
Yeah, it's interesting that we're having this conversation or debate because we've lost sight of it. I don't think our grandparents had to wonder much
Exactly.
what money was, and today I think we conflate money with credit, and there are degrees of moneyness in different assets sometimes, including U.S. Treasury assets. So it's easy for people to become overwhelmed or confused by what ought to be a pretty simple concept. I mean, we ought to be able to understand money as simply the commodity we use to trade with each other, to get the stuff we want so we don't have to barter.
Right.
I mean, that's really what money is for, so that we don't have to barter. And it solves the divisibility problem. If I don't want to buy a whole cow from you, but I want to buy, the flank steaks from you, well, here's how we do that.
Right.
Especially if the cow's alive. So that's how money arose on the marketplace, as a tool, as a tech, as a form of tech, just like fire or the wheel, to solve that problem.
Right.
Early on, all kinds of things were used for money, like stones and salt. Salzburg in Austria, that's where salt came from, and salt was measurable, and you could pretty much tell the purity of it. And then gold and silver, of course, were measurable. You could tell the purity. You could weigh the ounces. You could assay the purity. So those became standards out of the market. And it's important to understand there's a whole side of the progressive left and modern monetary theorists, MMT people. They dispute this. I mean, as a matter of historical fact, they dispute that this is how money arose, as a marketplace commodity that solved this problem of barter. They absolutely deny that. They say that money came from government issuance, and early on that was kings.
Wow.
So, and of course, once there started to be money, especially in the form of gold and silver coins, which have been used for many thousands of years. Then, of course, politics got involved. And yes, there was a tendency by kings and monarchs to say, hey, why don't I take that gold or silver coin and melt it down, add a little bit of iron or something worth a lot less to it, recast it, and take that little bit of gold or silver that I took out of it and keep that for myself, right? Coin clipping. So that is an early form of government depredation on currency. So that's nothing new today when we say the government devalues our money. Kings and monarchs did that in the past. That was a little more obvious to people. They knew it. They could look and see and feel that coin in their hands. In an electronic world, it becomes a little more convoluted, a little more circuitous,
Right.
But the bottom line is that once money became political, which is to say governments either produced it themselves, and even when there was a gold or silver backing to it, those governments then decreed a ratio of ounces or grams to their currency. That's a form of price fixing. Ever since that happened, we've really lost, apart from the devaluation question, separate question, but we've really lost our understanding of money and moneyness. And so really, at least since the Franklin era, the Roosevelt era, we haven't had a real sense of money as something that represents, even in paper form, an underlying commodity asset like gold.
Yeah, it is interesting that I think whether you're on the gold standard, silver standard, I think people forget that probably either our parents or our grandparents, if they took $1 to a bank, I guess legally they were supposed to get that value of gold, right? If we were on the gold standard. And I think that concept even, so like my niece today would never understand that concept. Like she is like that generation of say Gen Z, Gen Y is completely removed from that. And they have no concept of that. So in the sense that you're right, once money became once whatever was being used for currency, I should say, became more based on representation than actual holding of that currency, that's when you start to get into trouble. And I think that's when you hear someone say fiat currency, that's what they're talking about, right? Like it's a debt currency, it's a debt-based currency, correct?
Well, I like the term political money.
Okay.
Versus market money. But fiat means it can be issued at will by a government treasury or central bank and need not be backed by anything that would put a limit on that creation. So a pure fiat currency, when you look at an example like the former Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe now, the former Rhodesia, or someplace like that, where you had a crazed government that literally just started printing and printing, with the Weimar Germany, Argentina to an extent in the late 90s, more recently Venezuela.
Or even the U.S., right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's all we do, right? Yeah.
And Turkey. I mean, Turkey's had the last 5 years, Turkey has had a terrible currency crisis. So this stuff isn't just part of ancient history. I mean, we can see it today.
You're right. And to the extent that, let's say, we want to get back in some, say, maybe not in our lifetimes, but maybe our children's or our grandchildren's lifetimes, we want to get back to real money, market money, sound money, whatever term you want to use. Gold, of course, silver, platinum, the precious metals always enter the conversation, right? Because they have a store of value. They're permanent. We forgot to mention permanence, right? As a quality of money that, when I have some money, it doesn't disappear when I die, right? I could pass it on to my heirs, and that gold fit that description, silver, right? Diamonds. Do you think that now the problem, the problem with having gold, say, as your currency is that it's difficult to divide. Like, how much gold do you take down to your local pizzeria to get a couple of slices? That becomes problematic, right? And that's probably how paper money arose, right? Being backed by gold. It's not backed by anything now other than the credit and faith of the U.S. government. Do you think Bitcoin solves that? And I say Bitcoin as opposed to Ethereum or other forms of crypto necessarily for two reasons. One, it's the more popular one. Two, there's a commitment, as I understand the tech, to like it's deflationary, right? There's a fixed amount. It'll never go past whatever amount, what is it, 11 billion, 11 trillion, whatever it is, Bitcoins, it'll never go past that. So do you see something like Bitcoin eventually becoming a standard of money? Is it a craze? Is it more of an asset than a currency? How do you view that?
Well, it's up to the market to decide. I hope it does. And yes, Bitcoin does solve that problem of divisibility. And that was one of the big problems with gold, of course.
Yes.
It's heavy, it's expensive to store, to vault, to insure, to ship as a settlement between two parties. And so that's why bills arose, because some bills in your pocket were a lot easier to deal with, and $1 could represent 1/35 of an ounce of gold or whatever. But now we have a digital world, so that divisibility problem really goes away. Now, Bitcoin addresses that, but also you could still use gold, and you could have a bank card or whatever issued by your bank that simply, you go buy those 2 slices at your pizzeria, and it simply knocks off a tiny little bit, however it converts that with your balance in ounces. And, so gold in and of itself can certainly be divided using digital technology. That's not particularly hard. And there have been attempts at that, ATM cards and stuff that already over the years. I root for Bitcoin. I know a lot of very serious Bitcoin skeptics. I know a lot of very serious Bitcoin, maxis, all in. Sell your house, sell your car, don't have a chair, sit on and so I own Bitcoin. I buy it every couple of weeks on an auto pay type thing. Mm-hmm. But I can't say for sure, because that's up to the market. The market ultimately decides what's money. And obviously I'm biased towards gold. I work for a company that's involved in the leasing and bond business with gold and platinum and silver. And also the 5,000-year track record. Yes, it's certainly possible that Bitcoin will upend gold and completely remove its role as anything other than jewelry or industrial use, and remove any role as a financial asset. But it's also possible that it won't, because again, that's up to the marketplace. Unfortunately, that's slightly up to governments as well. And so I think that the antagonism between the two camps is something that I get caught in the middle of. But yeah, I think that divisibility problem is perfect fodder for the digital age we live in.
Yeah. And it's funny, sometimes the people you run across either personally or in their writings that are so anti-crypto, like Peter Schiff, I thought would be like, yeah, let's go Bitcoin. But he's one of those guys that's like, oh, it's a scam, whatever. And it's kind of interesting to me that even people that we might describe as 100% free marketeers or libertarian, for lack of a better word right now, would be against crypto like that. So that's interesting to me. Okay, Let me ask you one final question. Theoretically, if say the U.S. government, we had a constitutional amendment limiting the supply of money, the printing press, as it were, to some formula that we kind of negotiated. And I'm not anywhere near an economist to tell you what that formula is, whatever it is, like 2% of GDP or whatever. Would you find that an acceptable sort of system to have?
No.
Why not? Tell me why.
There are proposals. One of them is called NGDP targeting. These proposals are stepchildren of monetarism, Milton Friedman, who basically said use the money supply itself to apply the gas or the brakes to the economy. There are economists working today who say, well, let's target a particular nominal rate of GDP growth and expand our supply, the so-called money supply accordingly. I don't like any of this market tinkering. I don't think that government officials or central bank officials will ever stick to any kind of rules. And we've seen that in 2008. They just said, oh my gosh, we have to do whatever we have to do to bail out AIG. And we will do, we will take the Fed's balance sheet 4 or 5x. Then they went way beyond that in 2020 in the response to COVID. So first and foremost, I just don't believe that if government officials or central bank officials will ever abide by these rules, or the Congress would ever hold them to these rules in a crisis, which we have all the time. But beyond that, I just think that the nature of central banks is that they can't be tinkered with, they can't be reformed, they have to be thrown out lock, stock, and barrel, and that we need to oppose them using all of the rhetorical tools or political tools at our disposal, as opposed to this kind of negotiating with them. So there's certainly areas where I would say, look, let's have that 10% tax cut. But when it comes to central banking, I think it's just so inherently flawed, so inherently evil, and so inherently anti-capitalist to have money issued and run by governments. Is like saying, what if all the apartments and houses in America were provided by the state? What if all the cars? What if all the schools? I mean, too many of them are. We would just say, wow, what is this? The Soviet Union's North Korea? But yet we call ourselves a capitalist country, and half of every transaction, one side's the good or service being traded, the other side's the currency being paid. Half of every transaction is basically controlled by a sort of a Politburo. I'm not a fan of rules-based proposals for the Fed.
Okay, fair enough. Good answer. So then let me ask you this. If there is sort of like this will of the people, the will of the nation to move towards market money away from political money, do you think that will have to necessarily involve a revolution? I almost wanted to say violence, but I don't want to say violence necessarily as a negative connotation. But do you feel it would take almost an overthrow of the government in general? Like, it's not going to take just getting rid of the Fed. It's going to take something as revolutionary as what happened in 1776, where, hey, we just got to press the reset button because we're so far down the rabbit hole when it comes to central banks and fiat money and the the whole government spending in general, like that we can't control, so will it take a will to say we're willing to trash the government? Or do you think there's a possibility that within the framework of, say, the current U.S. government, we can get away from political money to market money or real money?
Wow, that is a tough one. People want to be paid, especially entitlements. And the so-called fiscal gap, the projected difference between what we're likely to take in tax revenue under even a rosy scenario over the next, let's say, 30 to 50 years,
right, and
what we've promised people in entitlements, the gap, the delta between those two is something like $200 trillion with a T. So entitlements are unpayable. And we have to understand that. Those are debts, whether the federal government calls them debts or not. Any private company would have to account for that pension liability as a debt. So those are debts. Those are promises to pay that cannot be paid in any meaningful way. They might, you can pay them nominally if you just print. So that's the day of reckoning. The baby boomers may get in under the wire. And to the extent they do, I don't think there's any political will from that voting bloc to make any significant changes. But, if we go back to 2008, the total worldwide debt load, government sovereign debt, corporate debt, business debt, household debt, mortgages, credit cards, student loans, everything was about 140 something trillion dollars. That was 2008. That was at the crisis. Now it's 305 trillion. So it's more than doubled. So it's clear that there's going to be almost a biblical debt jubilee, and how it takes place, whether it actually takes place in an admitted fashion or whether it takes place by simply inflating those debts into nothingness. But either way, governments, businesses, individuals, households around the world are not going to be able to repay all that debt.
Right.
So how do you have the great reset on debt? Maybe the powers that be want to tie that in with climate change, or maybe they want to tie it in with a new world order where we don't drive as much, or we consume less meat, or there's all kinds of ways of looking at that. It's just it's so far above my pay grade. I mean, I can't even begin. But I'll tell you how I hope it unravels is some sort of decentralized fashion where there are different parts of America splitting up, perhaps politically, creating, deciding to use Bitcoin or something else going
Right.
forward, and that that investors should take a haircut, not ordinary people, right? If you buy U.S. Treasury debt, if you're funding this beast, then just like in Iceland, you should take the haircut, not average people through inflation. So, I don't know why anybody's lending Uncle Sam money for any reason at anything less than junk bond rates.
Mm.
But here we are. So all these pension and hedge funds and all these, university endowments, and that's not all rich fat cats either. There's a lot of little old ladies who have a little bit of money, in their
Right.
whatever pension or whatever, a Vanguard fund or whatever it might be. So let's not just act like there's somehow this rich class that average people won't be hurt too. But it sure seems to me that if there's going to be a default, it ought to be the investors rather than the general taxpaying public who pays for that default. If you lent, if Lehman Brothers has to go under, then Lehman Brothers should go under. If Bank of America has to go under, instead of buying Countrywide being saved by Uncle Sam, then it should go under. At some point, I think we have to let all these defaults and bankruptcies happen. That's very tough politically. There's no political will for austerity. But I don't know how you rebuild an economy until you suck out all this debt and restructure assets.
Yeah. Well, there is a destructive portion to capitalism that most people don't want to admit to. Who was it that did that? Was it Schumpeter who proposed that? I don't remember. Do you know if I have that right?
Well,
Was
there's
it
a
Schumpeter?
crash, right? I mean, that's in many ways, the harm is done during the boom, and the bust is really just the reckoning. But I mean, there's an action and a reaction to all of this monetary and fiscal tinkering. And the sad part is, though, John, is that sometimes people do get away with it in their lifetimes. In other words, the politicians vote for things and they're dead before the problems come home to roost. I mean, the politicians who passed Social Security, I mentioned the entitlement crisis.
Right.
The politicians who passed that, they're long dead. When they passed that bill in the 1930s, there were something like 13 workers for every one retiree or something,
Right.
And now there's 2 or 3 maybe. So
yeah, I mean, people forget. Yeah, people forget when Social Security had the initial retirement age of 65 to start paying out benefits, the average life expectancy was 67 for men and 68 for women. So literally that told you what the government was thinking. We'll pay you for 3 years, right? But now it's crazy, right? It's never been adjusted. And so even as a statist program, it's failing because it just never was thought out properly, at least since FDR's time. Okay, great stuff. But I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation on that. So let me ask you this: do you think that society in general, in other fashions, is becoming decentralized, except for when it comes to money, the economy, and the government? For example, you and I might naturally say, "Hey, I'm building out a studio to do podcasts." I go on eBay, I go on Amazon, I search for this. I search for the best value for what I'm willing to get. It may come from China, may come from Korea, may come from Europe, it may be somewhere in Texas. I don't know, right? And I don't care at the end of the day. And in that way, I think technology has enabled a lot of decentralization in that sense. Whereas, look, in 1990, I would have to go to my local Best Buy to build out a studio at much, much more cost to me, right? Now it takes me a tenth of the cost. And that's always been the history of unregulated markets, right? No matter what you could think of, if it's unregulated, it starts out expensive when it's leading edge, and then it becomes, the affordability of it comes down, except for things like housing, healthcare, education, things that the government regulates, right?
Absolutely.
So do you feel that there's sort of this paradox going on where people intuitively understand the benefits of decentralization in their day-to-day lives, but they can't seem to, for the most part, apply that to money and government?
Yeah, it's a good question whether the tech digital world is more decentralized or less. So you could argue either way. Obviously, governments are digging in their heels, and they went from having power at the town level to the state level to the regional level to the federal level, and now at the international level, we want to have things like the UN,
Right.
the World Bank, the IMF, the WEF. We want to have more and more control centralized there. You used to have multiple currencies in Europe; they were replaced by the euro.
Right.
So there's lots of ways you could say the world is getting, unfortunately, more centralized. But on the flip side, you talk about that price deflation that happens with the internet pricing and being able to buy stuff all over the world. That's beautiful. But also information. I think the centralization of information has really been struck a blow by the internet age. I can remember being a kid. It was basically you had your local paper. If your parents were a little more erudite or whatever, they might have gotten the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. In addition, you had your local news. That was at 7, and that was, it was by the minute. Sports
Yes.
was 7:20, movies was 7:25. Local. It was really formulaic. And then after that, you had your national news, which was basically 3 networks, Walter Cronkite or whatever. And that was that. And you didn't have really any other choice for information other than big libraries. You might have a public library or you might have a university library. But when I was a kid, they wouldn't have had Hayek, particularly. They certainly wouldn't have had Rothbard or Mises. They might have had a little bit of Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman, right, something like that. That would be the extent of it. So information was a lot more dear to our grandparents. For us, it's not about getting information. It's about filtering it, because we've got too much coming at us. Right? We have all this white noise. And so we have to use our time constraints and our energy constraints to say, yeah, it's fun to be on Twitter, but I ought to be reading this, So our problem is the opposite of our grandparents.
Yeah.
They had to go to the library and find out about stuff. We have to sift. So I would say that's a real victory. And I think the powers that be hate the open and free internet. I think they hate it with a passion. I think that's why they want to regulate it. I think that's why they want to kick people off Twitter. I think that's why they want to criminalize so-called hate speech or disinformation about COVID, right, or whatever it might be. So they're clearly rattled. But do we have centralized gatekeepers of a sort? In the new world, is Amazon a gatekeeper? Is eBay a gatekeeper? Is Twitter a gatekeeper? These big, we envisioned a world that didn't have the old hub and spoke model. IBM had a corporate headquarters, and then it had satellites and all this. And the distribution system for a company like GM with its cars, was a hub and spoke. We said, well, the internet shouldn't look like that. It should look like this patchwork of kind of little of spider webs with little, concentrated centers all over the place. But if you were to paint that picture today, there might be some choke points. Before Elon Musk, for example, we saw that it was easy for government to pressure Twitter, and Twitter complied and pulled people off. So, all things considered, I think it's probably pretty good for us that we have all these options available to us, and that it's harder to control information, and everything really comes from that. And also education. The idea that you can hop on YouTube or Udemy or something like that and go take that algebra class that you didn't like in 7th grade. That's pretty incredible. And
I got to tell you, Jeff, I lament the fact that there was no internet and no YouTube when I was going to college, because honestly, I'm a visual learner. You hear that it's a bit of a hack sort of categorization, but like I've stayed up for 12 hours straight going down the rabbit hole of quantum mechanics, and I'm not a physicist, right? But it's just something that interests me, right? And I don't know if the generations today truly realize sort of that they're on the precipice of this new age of information and of learning and of amplifying that effect, so it's interesting to me to see how that, for as long as I'm around, to see how that takes off and if it does take off, because I agree with you. I think it is great that information has become, in a sense, freer. And about your internet comments, isn't it interesting that I doubt if many, I use the word kids, and I know it's probably wrong of me, but if any kids today understand that the internet initially was created as an outcome, it was like an outgrowth of the Cold War, where someone said, hey, we have to have a distributed network where the Russians couldn't take out the US communication grid with one strike. Like, we want this decentralized sort of many nodes that all connect, and they're not all on one path. Unfortunately, I remember taking network theory when I was in college, but and yet now you hear for calls in some quarters of, let's get the internet regulated. Let's get the internet under government control. So we have a gatekeeper, and we are protecting. It's always in the form of a benefit, right? Protecting the children, eliminating pornography or whatever, right? So that sort of evolution is kind of interesting to me, if not ironic, that we hear that. Okay, let's move on a little bit for the sake of time. I once I saw an interview, I forget with who, where you were involved, and you said Donald Trump had to happen. Donald Trump was necessary. If not Donald Trump, the idea of Donald Trump. Quickly, tell me a little bit about that, what you meant by that.
Yeah, I think he had to happen because the Bush and Clinton crime families had to be stopped. I don't think he was some deep state planner or anything. I think he was just this crazy guy who caught the powers that be unaware, and they thought Hillary Clinton would beat him easily. That progressivism thinks there's an arc to history, that things are always getting better, and there's an inevitability of socialism, and that Hillary Clinton represented that first female president, and there was an air of inevitability, a deterministic arc. And when that was shattered by this crazy guy, the left lost their minds and had to go into an almost unbelievable degree of psychological coping.
Yes.
Russiagate, whatever it might be. And so, Donald Trump did this country a favor by doing that. And we got to recognize it as such. It was never about him or his policies or his personnel or any of that stuff. I mean, I don't want him to run again. I wish he'd go away. He won't. But that was his role. And maybe now we're seeing maybe Vivek Ramaswamy was put on earth just to show the world how awful Nikki Haley is. Right. I mean, if that's, I know he's a billionaire or whatever he did with was a little bit of a shady biotech type company, and some, there were some FDA approvals that didn't happen, and so the valuation crashed. But he had sold some stock in the parent before that. Oh, okay, is that capitalism? But he's obviously a very smart guy, and the idea that he is attacking Nikki Haley for the empty, brainless person she is, who would never be anywhere close to even sniffing the presidency were she not female, is just beautiful. Right. That's his job. That's his role. And if he does nothing else, then we salute him for it. So, I mean, I'm so jaundiced towards the political class that I don't, I tend to see things probably more sinister than they are. But, I think Trump had to happen. And it was so important to get this country off this one-way train to progressive fantasy land that it just mystified me that people couldn't see the victory in this. The fact that 70 or 75 million Americans were willing to go off the reservation to that degree and vote for this guy over the totally known evil of Hillary. The devil was Hillary. Right. I mean, we knew her. Did we know her?
No, believe me, I agree with that. I have to tell you, I'm much like yourself. I wish Trump would go away, but I have to admit to being very much an anti-Trumper, not because he was the monkey wrench, if I can paraphrase what you said. It's not for the fact that he was the monkey wrench in the system. That I'm totally down with. But I'm just wondering if the result of a Trump presidency and a Trump presence has actually yielded something that's worse for liberty. That's my concern, right? So, for example, and the question I kind of had written out is nationalism at odds with the ideals of liberty? And I tend to think it is. And if other than him being the monkey wrench in the process, the guy who pulled back the curtain on the wizard, is the aftermath of his presidency something worse than what we started out with? What do you think?
Well, it might be. That's a fair point. I mean, I always want us to see the world with clear eyes as it is. And so one thing that Trump and Brexit and some other mid 2010s phenomena showed us is that the left are the reactionaries. So that was beautiful. They're so used to having everything. They had the progressive century. They won everything in the 20th century. Income tax, central banking, ideological world wars, Great Society, New Deal, Civil Rights Act. I mean, they were so used to winning everything. You know, legalized abortion. I mean, they're so used to dominating. The slightest pushback or even slowing in their program drives them just absolutely insane.
Oh, they lose their minds. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And they demonstrate how reactionary they really are. So, you know, that's I think one way to look at it. But will that reactionary backlash actually make us worse off? You know, where we've only got approved candidates like, let's say, Nikki Haley versus Joe Biden or something like that. My God. Yeah, maybe. But nonetheless, I still would say it had to happen. And I think nationalism is a red herring. America's not a nation. It's not even close. I mean, we're barely a country. America is basically an economic arrangement, and things work pretty well here. And an economic arrangement is not nothing. I'm not downplaying that. Economic arrangement's a lot. But the idea that we have a shared country is just so obviously incorrect. And then within America, I would say there's probably many nations, micronations. And, you know, everybody, I think this libertarians really missed the boat here. So, you know, this right-wing nationalism, that was never a threat to America. The left, the eighth grade teacher at your local school who thinks everything should be, you know, nationalized is infinitely greater threat than any Trumper. And you know, the idea that we are going to have some sort of nationalist movement in the U.S., unless that involved the breakaway movement of smaller nations, you know, it's just nations, I think, can exist independent of states. I think you can have an organic nation, the Catalans, who straddle France and Spain, for example. A lot of the French and Spanish are like, I can't stand these guys, good riddance. A lot of Spanish libertarians say, Jeff, you're all wrong about Catalan independence because they want to have this big government socialist state. They're way to the left of the Spanish national government. And so you'd actually, by supporting this Catalan independence, you're actually supporting bigger government. It's like, well, okay. So you can say the same thing about Scottish independence. They want to join with the EU and be well to the left of what they see as, you know, being governed by right-wing, relatively capitalist parliament in London, right? And they want to be governed by Holyrood and be like the Baltic states. They want to be like Norway, you know, and have a much. And so, you know, people say, well, you shouldn't support Scottish independence, Jeff, because that would result in less liberty for those people. But personally, I don't want to impose my views on progressives. I don't think that's. I think we need to start talking about separation. We talk endlessly about persuasion. I think separation is the way, and I think universalizing everything and centralizing everything has been a big cause of all this angst and hatred and division in this country. In other words, you know, why should people in California have to worry so much about who Alabama selects as a senator? Well, because unfortunately we federalized a hell of a lot of things in this country that ought to be localized, like abortion. Right? I think the left should have cheered the end of Roe v. Wade. And as we've seen, they've won some victories at the state level since then. I would say we're probably a 60-40 pro-choice country.
Yeah,
right?
I don't disagree with you on that, in the sense that believing in liberty, true liberty, means that you should allow people to let them live their lives as they see fit. And if they, hey, look, it's always a problem. If you let someone do what they want, they may not do what you want, right? That's an eventuality you have to be able to accept if you claim to be a proponent of liberty, right? That there might be a state out there that if secession was, say, the result, and there were 50 individual, like you said, nations throughout this country, yeah, be prepared that many of them, if you're pro-life, will become pro-choice, and
Right.
and vice versa. So to use that particular issue, but yeah, what was it Friedman said? If you those who do not want liberty object to it, probably because they have a fear of liberty, that they just don't think on a very intrinsic level that liberty will work, that there's always going to be a problem with liberty. So that's an interesting proposal. Okay, just quickly now, let me get your thoughts. What do you think the election of Javier Milei in Argentina, A, do you think he'll have a successful run as the president? And B, what is the effect on the U.S., say, of his presidency?
Well, I hope he does. And his dollarization idea, it would probably help stem some of the bleeding of the Argentine peso. And it's pretty easy. Well, it's certainly technically feasible. They don't need lots and lots of dollars, physical or digital, as I've heard some economists claim. Like, where are they going to get all these dollars to dollarize it? Prices can adjust.
Right.
And the U.S. dollar, for all of its faults, is much more stable than their own currency. So I do think, as an interim step, that's probably wise, and we shouldn't be too hard on him for not wanting to immediately create some Bitcoin paradise or something. I mean, he's got a lot of history in that country. He's got a big population. He's got older generations. I mean, it's not so simple, and he's also got a real left wing to deal with.
Yes.
There is a real hard left in Argentina that, we've got a hard left here in America now too. But so it's easy to take pot shots, but I wish him well. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I hope he focuses on the economy. And
it's interesting.
But he already denounced the BRICS idea, so I wonder if he is doing that to make nice with the powers that be in Washington.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because he's a weird blend, or a refreshing blend, depending on your point of view, of free market, ANCAP, libertarian, use your term, ideas, and a presentation that's wrapped up in a Donald Trump type of presentation. So I think that's a weird. Whereas you could say, well, Trump was the ultimate showman. He's the ultimate empath when it comes to connecting with those that he sees as his people. I would never argue that Donald Trump has any sort of sound understanding of what we would call the correct economic principles, right, and market principles. Whereas I think Milei does. I think Milei does have that sort of base of good, whether you want to say Austrian economic theory or whatever, but it's also presented to you in a very Trump way, like taking a chainsaw everywhere he went to live. And that, what was that little video he put out where he lined up all the agencies of the Argentine government, and he'd say Ministry of Sport, nada, and he'd rip it off the board, or whatever, Education Department, gone. So I for one, look, realistically, he's going to, the best he could hope for is gridlock in that country. Like you said, there's a very hard left and moderate sort of thing that are going to fly in his face at every turn. So I think the best he can hope for is gridlock. But just as a proof of concept, like, hey, here's a guy who did this and he got elected, I think that's a positive. But we'll see. To your point, we'll see how it turns out. Okay, Jeff, I love this discussion. I wish we could go on for much longer, but it can't. So let me wrap this up in what we usually do with our guests, which is we're going to play a round of silly questions. These are going to be 5 questions I'm going to throw out at you. There's no right or wrong answer. I just want your response to them. So here we go, okay? Number 1, do you have a favorite leisure activity?
Yeah, I should be able to answer that quicker. Used to be golf, but I've gotten away from that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you used to be golf.
I was hardcore in my 20s. Yep.
Okay, fair enough. All things considered, readability, accessibility, basic principles. Which economist's work would you assign to college students to undo the damage done to them by their professors? All things considered.
Henry Hazlitt for his, journalist with a clear writing style.
Hazlitt, excellent. Yeah. It's funny. When I run into like kids my niece and my nephew's age in college, I tend to ask them to look at all the YouTube series from Free to Choose with Milton Friedman, because we could quibble about some of his policies, but I think also being a professor, he had a great way of getting through to people on a very understandable level. But Hazlitt works for me too. Many people cite his, Economics in One Lesson or something like that in that book. Yeah, they cite that as their, okay, great, Hazlitt. Greatest movie ever made?
Either Godfather 2 or Apocalypse Now.
Okay, I'm not even going to argue because those are such great answers. I'm not even going to bother saying anything about that. If you could have dinner with any 3 historical figures, who would they be and why? What would you talk about?
Well, maybe not historical, but one would have to be my dad. One would probably be not Ayn Rand, because she was such a ball buster. It wouldn't be a fun companion.
I love that. I love that.
But probably Hazlitt and maybe Mises.
There you go. Mises, Hazlitt, and your dad. Great answer. And the last one, which needs to fall first, fiat money or centralized government?
I think money is the key. I think money is what makes those big governments possible.
All right. Jeff Deist, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time in this great conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. This was a great talk. Everyone, you've been listening to the Big Questions with Big John with Jeff Deist. Jeff, give us your socials or any contact info you'd like so that people can follow some of your work.
Well, they can. I do occasionally write articles at Monetary Metals, our website, but also I'm on Twitter at Jeff Deist, all one word.
Jeff Deist on Twitter, one word. We will have that at the bottom of the screen so people can follow you on Twitter. Folks, follow Jeff on Twitter. He's always got some insights that are worth your time, I guarantee you. All right, until next time, this has been Big John. See you later. Have a good life. Peace.